Good evening, everyone. My name's Jeremy. I'll be leading these sessions this month. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out on a cold winter's night. We've got 4 sessions this month, and you're probably familiar with the way that these sessions run. We normally do some meditation, and I'll talk a bit on some Buddhist practices and ideas. And normally I just talk about the ones that I've found useful, that I can talk about with conviction, and tell you about how I've found them to be helpful. And then we'll have good question and answer time. So please feel free to ask any questions. And as I always say, the Buddha encouraged you to challenge any of his ideas, so you're not required to just accept them. In fact, he encouraged people not to accept his ideas, just to challenge them as much as they want to. And it's a good way to learn, and particularly about spiritual practice, I think, is to question and investigate and discuss. And there's so many different ideas about spiritual practice and different ways of doing things, and through investigation we find practices and ideas that work best for us. So we'll start by doing some meditation. So what is meditation? Meditation is defined as the practice of familiarizing your mind with a positive mental object, so something that makes your mind peaceful. So the opposite of that would be familiarizing your mind with something that's disturbing your mind, as we often do. Focus on something that's upsetting us, dwell on it, bring it up over and over again in our mind, something that someone's done to us or something that we did wrong in the past. And so that would be like the opposite of meditation, where we're bringing an object to mind which is disturbing the mind, making us feel unhappy. So meditation, we're trying to do the opposite and just focus the mind on a mental object which is making the mind peaceful and calm and happy, and also more productive, or maybe that's not the right word, more, I guess, useful, that makes the mind more able to do what we want to do, like communicate clearly with people, things like that. And the idea of meditation is it's not just something that we do when we're sitting on our cushion, but something that we're eventually, through practice, doing all the time. And so our mind becomes familiar with positive objects, and the more familiar they become, the more easily they come to our mind. So that's the idea, and eventually, even apparently in your sleep, you can be meditating and focusing your mind on positive objects. So that's what meditation is. And as I always like to remind people, that the main 2 tools that we need with meditation are, one is mindfulness, which in this context means remembering the object that you're focusing your mind on. So if you're focusing on the breath, for example, you're remembering to keep your mind on that object. And introspection, which is observing your mind to see whether it's wandered off and is thinking about other things that you weren't planning to think about, so it's forgotten about the object. So they're the 2 main tools that we try to identify and then use when we're doing meditation. Okay, so as you're probably aware, it's helpful to sit in a position that is conducive to concentration. So normally people find it better to have their back straight, which stops your mind from becoming drowsy, sleepy. And most people find it helpful to have their eyes closed and just slightly open with some light coming through, so you don't get sleepy, but also not distracted. So anyway, just find a posture that is comfortable and helps you to concentrate, remain alert. And then also helpful, I think, to decide to stop thinking about all the things that you're currently occupied with in your life, all the things that are going on. So just give yourself permission to stop thinking about all of those things for the next hour. And then just firstly bring your attention to your body. Just become aware of your body, how your body's feeling, and relax your body. You can do this by exhaling, and as you breathe out, you feel that all the stress and tension is leaving your body. Your body becomes relaxed and light. And then bring your focus just to your breath. So our object here is the breathing, just observing the breath moving in and out. So what we're trying to do is focus our mind just on the breath and forget about everything else. So that's mindfulness, remembering the object, keeping it in mind. So in the beginning, I think this can feel a bit like we're sort of constricting our mind, like trying to stop it from doing what it wants to do. But I think it's helpful to think of it more as giving your mind a break from the constant discursive thoughts. So just think, I'm giving my mind a break, like a rest or a holiday from constantly jumping from one mental object to the other, which it's normally doing, like a monkey. So the monkey mind, you're saying, just have a break from doing that. Just relax from doing that. And place your mind or rest your mind on that object of breath, moving in and out. And then, as I said, introspection is observing to see whether your mind is staying on the object or is wandering off. And if it wanders off, you just bring it back, rest it on the object, let go of discursive thought. So this might be the only time in your whole week where your mind actually has a rest from constantly jumping from one thing to the other, which we do even in our sleep. So this is a real rest, a real break for your mind from that constant discursive thought, the monkey mind. You might find it helpful to count the breaths. So breathing in and out is one, and can help you to keep track of whether your mind's wandering off or not. So just count 1 breath, 2 breaths, 3 breaths, and then if you lose track, just start again. Back to 1. So again, just remember to use mindfulness to keep the object in mind, stop your mind from wandering off. So remembering the object is mindfulness, and alertness is observing to see how your mind is, whether it's paying attention or is wandering off. And if it's wandering off, then it brings it back, place it back on the object. So we don't have to use force. It's not like forcing it to stay there. It's sort of like just giving it the space, giving your mind the space to rest on that object, free from discursive thought. Okay, so when you're ready, just relax your concentration. How did you go with that? Any thoughts or questions? Did you get the idea of mindfulness and introspection? Is that clear? They're two faculties that So there are faculties that we do normally have and use and in our daily life, but I think we're not in this way perhaps. So remembering, keeping an object in mind is something we need to do when we're concentrating on a task, like working or driving, for example. And introspection and observing to see whether our mind has wandered is also something we have to do, to see what our mind is doing. So we're just using them here to develop concentration. And do you also agree with that idea that it's giving your mind a break from discursive thought? Can you see how the discursive thought is sort of keeping your mind busy jumping from one thing to another all the time, and that is a bit sort of exhausting, and so we're giving our mind a break from that. So that's real relaxation when our mind can stop doing that. Because every object that our mind focuses on has an effect on us. So generally we have either attachment to objects that appear pleasant and we want to pull them closer, and aversion to things that appear unpleasant and we want to push them away or remove ourselves from them. And so we're constantly being pulled to all these objects of mind as they appear to our mind. And so that's a bit exhausting and also keeps our mind in a slightly sort of disturbed state, so not sort of peaceful. So the idea here is of stopping that, freeing your mind from that, giving it a break. And through familiarity with doing that, then, and as it becomes more and more pleasant, I think, particularly as the sort of that peaceful state of mind becomes stronger, then you become more and more interested in doing the practice and less interested in your mind jumping around. So I'm told. My mind is still very busy jumping around. Yeah. So I thought we could focus on this idea this month of, as you probably know, in Buddhist thought and practice, there's quite a lot of talk about what you might call deceptive appearances. And often in Buddhist literature and imagery, there's talk about things like mirages, and you know how a mirage is something that appears to exist in a certain way, like as water, for example, in a desert. And someone who's thirsty in a desert will be drawn towards that. And but we know that it's an illusion. It's caused by the effect of the gas, I think it is, and the heat appearing to be water. And another analogy is of a moth being drawn to a flame. So even though the flame is hurting the moth, they keep being drawn to it because they're so attracted to it, and the mind is so overwhelmed by the attachment or the attraction to that flame that they can't stop themselves from constantly going towards it, even though it's harming them. So there's quite a lot of images in Buddhist thought, and the idea is to sort of point out to us, well, this is the Buddha's assertion, and you don't have to agree with it, but it's something worth investigating. I think that things often don't exist in the way that they appear to. So I think we know that, from our experience, that we sometimes get sort of tricked by an appearance of something, and we relate to that object in a certain way because of the way it's appearing to our mind, and then later on through investigation or through understanding it better, we find that object or that person or whatever it is quite different to how we thought they are. And so there's this appearance, that a strong appearance has come to our mind and has sort of tricked us. We've responded to that appearance and then later on found out that it was mistaken. And so this is a strong theme in Buddhist thought and practice, and also in other particularly contemplative traditions, like in Hindu tradition, for example. This idea that our mind is sort of being tricked by these appearances and then responding to them, or believing in them and then responding to them, and that's causing us problems. So it's a really interesting idea, I think, and something worth investigating. The Dalai Lama often makes the point that the disturbing states of mind, the states of mind that bother us a lot, like, for example, anxiety or depression or irritation, these sort of things. So he says that they're based on a misunderstanding of the way things exist. And so he's saying that this is actually really good news for us, because it shows that if we were to correctly understand the way things are, then our mind would be free of that disturbing thought. So you think of an example like maybe anxiety. Think of something that you feel anxious about. Like public speaking, for example. If you're speaking in front of a group, we all find that a bit nerve-wracking. And so, then you think, so how is that based on a misconception? Like, how is that fear or that anxiety based on a misconception? And I think one way of thinking about that is that we're exaggerating the threat in our mind. So the worst thing that can happen is when you give a talk or something and it goes really badly and people walk out or throw things at you or something, or you stop talking and you can't think of anything to say. And so that's kind of the worst case scenario. And so we blow that up hugely in our mind that would be a complete disaster. And that's because of, this, I guess you'd call it pride. We want ourselves always to be looking, like, what's the word? Doing a good job. We always want to be doing a good job. Effective. Can't think of the word. Respected. You always want to be respected. That's true. Perfect. Yes. Competent. I think is the word I was thinking of. Yeah. So we're sort of always trying to manipulate situations so that we come out looking competent. You see that a lot in the workplace. People going to great lengths to present themselves in a good light and avoid looking stupid or hiding their mistakes and things like that. So that's constant. So the idea is that we sort of exaggerating the threat in that case of the fear of public speaking. And another example, I think, is maybe we're very sensitive to any kind of criticism. But again, what we're doing there is we're sort of blowing that criticism up into something, much bigger than what it is. So someone's harsh word towards us, like a rude sign someone does to you in the traffic, and it's so kind of offensive and makes us enraged. But if you sort of look at it in the grander scheme of things, it's so minute and tiny little problem that's not worth thinking about for even a second. And they're probably just having a bad day, or they might have, completely misunderstood the situation. So anyway, these are examples of how our mind sort of gets drawn in by appearances and then reacts to them. One example I was going to share with you, which is quite embarrassing for me, but when I was at uni and I was quite stressed with exams once, and I was coming out of the university, I was waiting at the busy road and I was waiting to turn in, and this guy came up to behind me and he banged into me, and I thought he was sort of pushing me to get going and sort of like out into the traffic. And I just sort of saw red and I jumped out of the car and started yelling at him. And then he said, actually you rolled back into me. And I had this old bombed out car, and I thought, that's probably right. So I was totally embarrassed, and I couldn't think of anything to say, and I just said, "Are you sure?" And he said, "Yes." And he said, "Is there any damage?" And I said, "I don't think so," and jumped in my car and drove off really quickly. This is one of those really embarrassing situations where your mind is totally overcome, by the appearance of the situation, and you've responded to it and got it completely wrong and responded badly. So you probably can think of examples in your own life where, you've done things like that, where you've just completely misread the situation. And, your mind has been completely fooled by the appearance and you've responded to it. So the Buddha is saying there's a lot of that sort of thing going on in our life. And so even though that can be a little bit sort of maybe depressing and humiliating, but also it's in one way quite liberating, because you can see that if we can just sort of identify where our mind is making mistakes in our day-to-day life, our lived experience, then it's possible to free our minds from making those mistakes, and then free our mind from that particular problem that we're experiencing. So for most of us, there's probably one or two things that bother us the most in our life, whether it be a difficult relationship with someone or a particular sort of psychological tendency. I think for me it's probably like work-related stress and family-related stress, and then also maybe like laziness. I find my laziness kind of really frustrating. So everyone's got their own sort of number one thing that they probably would like to change the most. I'm not sure. Maybe we could share what our number one thing is. So it's different for everyone, So if you focus on that thing, start with that thing, and try and just ask the question: is there something about that, or something that I'm not understanding correctly, which is causing that particular problem? Whether it be anxiety or so. Like with work-related stress, for example. So often we have this, again, I think this sort of pride that we want to be competent and do everything properly and be a good operator, a successful person, whatever that means, who gets everything done on time, and so it's just some idea we've got in our head of, what I want successful me to look like. I want to get things done on time, and I want to do them properly, and I want the people who I'm doing them for to be happy with me and all that kind of stuff. And when you analyze, it's sort of like it's actually never going to happen. Like sometimes you'll get things done right and on time, but there's going to be immediately 3 more things put on top of those, and you're never going to get them all done on time. I mean, that's the nature of the economy, isn't it? You just keep adding more. If there's a gap, you just add more. So what am I saying? It's just, so I'm thinking that kind of stress is related to a particular idea in my mind, and many people have the same idea of how things should be, how I'd like things to be, how I'd like myself to be, but maybe doesn't have any really correspondence with reality. It's just sort of some idea that I've invented about what a successful me would look like. So I don't know, maybe tell me what you think of that idea. Or other things you can think of, like states of mind that really bother you, and how they're related to misconceptions or mistaken views. I think stress is a big one for most people. I think most people are experiencing some degree of stress, which is a form of fear, anxiety about things not going the way we want them to, having an idea about how things should be, and then getting sort of worried when they're not going that way, or worried that they may not go that way. Work-related stress, or family-related stress. So anyway, this is the theme that I was hoping we could discuss this month, have a look at. And so just to put all that in context maybe a bit, I always like to start off discussion about spiritual practice with this idea that we're all trying to be happy and trying to avoid problems. I think that's something we can all agree on, and that's probably the same true for all, sentient beings, animals as well. You look at their behaviour and why they're doing that, and one answer you can give is because they're trying to be happy and trying to avoid problems. And then based on that, if we accept that, then if you look at all the, in human history, all the things that people have done through history to achieve that goal of being happy, and so many different kinds of things that people do, from including things like going to war, or killing their neighbour, or climbing mountains, or flying to the moon, and all the things that humans have done through history. And so we can sort of divide them into two categories. One is the pursuits that are based on looking outwards, outside the mind, for happiness. So by looking at material objects or people or achievements, and so we call them the sort of materialist or external approach. And then the spiritual traditions are looking more at the internal, so looking into the mind. So trying to find the cause of happiness and removing the causes of problems within the mind. So that's the sort of spiritual approach. And as I often say, the main problem with the material approach, the two main problems, one is that the material objects or the external objects are impermanent, they're always changing. So we only have a certain degree of control over them. They're always going to change. So if you're looking for happiness in an external object, then it's inherently problematic, because you don't have sort of control over that object. It's going to change. And not only is the object going to change, but it's also the way it appears to your mind is going to change. So that's a problem if you're trying to seek happiness in other people or in possessions or in things outside the mind. So that's one problem. And then the other problem is that the objects are external to the mind, so there's no necessary relationship between the object and your mind. So you can have huge amounts of wealth, for example, or fame, or beauty, but there's no guarantee that that's going to produce happiness in your mind. Sometimes it may, but there's no direct connection between that thing and a happy state of mind. So we can see many examples of that with people who have huge amounts of wealth or power, for example, but seem to be miserable, or even become suicidal. So obviously are miserable, unhappy. So that external object hasn't brought the happiness that they were seeking. So that's the other problem, is that they're external, so there's no direct relationship. So then if you accept that premise, then you're looking within your mind, what is it within my mind that would bring happiness? And so different spiritual traditions have different answer to that question. In the Buddhist tradition, the things within your mind which bring happiness, according to the Buddha at least, they're divided into the compassion or method side and the wisdom side. So they're to be like two wings of a bird, and we need both of them to get enlightened, compassion and wisdom. So all the Buddhist teachings and practices can basically be divided into those two, compassion and wisdom. Compassion is sometimes also referred to as method, the method side. So within compassion there's the compassion means the wish to free others from suffering or problems, and love, which is the other side, flip side, is wishing others to be happy and sort of striving for their happiness and to free them from suffering. And then sort of activities motivated by love and compassion, for example, like generosity, which is giving with the wish for others to be happy. Or patience means refraining from harm, or keeping your mind peaceful and strong in difficult situations. That's patience. And then morality or ethics basically means refraining from harming others and harming yourself. And what else? Enthusiastic effort means sort of joyful effort, means generating enthusiasm or joy in positive actions, again motivated by love and compassion. And then concentration, like we did before in our meditation. So concentration, if I'm not mistaken, concentration is used in both wisdom side and the compassion side. We need concentration for both. So you often see in Buddhist literature and imagery these two like wings of a bird. I think when the Buddhas have their hands together, that represents wisdom and compassion. And the mantra of Chan Rezik, which you'd be familiar with, Om Mani Padme Hum. So the Padme is a lotus in that mantra, and that refers to wisdom, the lotus. And Mani is the jewel, so that refers to compassion or the method side. So you see this appearing in many places. I think having 2 incense sticks as an offering represents wisdom and compassion. So a constant reminder that these are the 2 main things that we're trying to generate or cultivate within our mind in trying to attain the spiritual development. And so this month I'll be mostly focusing on the wisdom side, which is this idea of examining appearances, the way things appear. So wisdom in this context is defined as correctly seeing things in the way that they are. So your understanding or the way it's appearing to you is in line with how it actually exists. So the object that you're investigating, whether it's a person or an inanimate object. And so ignorance then is the other flip side of that, where there's a discrepancy between the way that thing is appearing to you and the way it actually exists. So before I gave the example of fear, anxiety, where in our mind we're greatly exaggerating the threat or the seriousness of the threat. So there's a discrepancy between how serious the threat is appearing to be and how serious it actually is. So people say that some people are like giving a public talk is just as scary as dying. They say in my mind the thought of death and thought of giving a public talk are about equal, and but then you compare it to how great the actual risk is there. So you compare it to like the risk of going for a drive in the car. So the risk of getting harmed in a motor accident is much higher than anything bad that's going to happen to you when you're giving a public talk. But no one's nervous about getting in a car and going for a drive. Well, most people aren't. So that's the way our mind works. It doesn't have a correct understanding of how great the risk is, and it's exaggerating the threats. So when the threat of being embarrassed can be hugely anxiety-provoking, but actually how much harm you could get from that is nothing compared to what you could get from a car accident, for example. So that's just an example of how the appearances are deceiving us. And attachment is another one too, where we get very strong grasping or desire to own or get close to an object or a person, and that's based on an exaggerated view of that object. So our mind is greatly exaggerating their good qualities and then trying to get close or possess that thing, or because we're projecting those those exaggerated qualities onto that person or that object. Or it could even be an activity like gambling, for example. So if your mind is addicted to gambling, then you're having this thought that one day I'm going to get lucky and I'm going to pay off all my debts and all my problems will be over because I'll hit the jackpot. And so you keep coming back, and even though you're losing money over and over again and your life's kind of going downhill, you keep trying to get back that money you've lost and think one day I'm going to strike it lucky. I've got a family, relative who exactly like that, has lost everything at Crown Casino. Everything's gone. Yeah, so that's an example, attachment to a particular idea, you know. Anyway, that's probably enough talking from me. So that's basically what we'll be looking at, this idea, different ways in which our mind creates these appearances, and then how those appearances cause us or deceive us into doing harmful activities or generate harmful states of mind which cause us problems, and how by seeing how the mind is being deceived and how those appearances are deceptive, then we can free ourselves from that particular problem. And our mind, can become, free of that and happy and released from that problem. That's the idea. So that's what we're talking about this month. So, enough talking from me. Any questions or thoughts or disagreements? Feel free to disagree, as I said. Or we can just sit in silence. Would anyone like to suggest another example of a deceptive appearance that has caused them problems? Can you think of anything? Or something that sort of bothers you on a regular basis, and how that's related to a misunderstanding of the situation, or how it might be. Like an annoying person, for example. Most of us have one particularly annoying person in their life, even if it's a public figure, a politician, for example. So think about that person, and so that every time you think about them, you feel a bit irritated and wish that they'd go away or stop talking, or change in the way that you'd like them to, or see that what they're doing is really annoying. And so if the Buddha's standing beside you saying, well, you're bothered by this person because you're not correctly understanding the situation. You say, okay, Buddha, what am I not understanding correctly? So one way, I think, is to see that when someone's bothering us, we're very much relating to them in the way that they make us feel. So that person, that annoying person, you think about them and then you get this sort of irritated feeling or aversion towards them. And then, so we're sort of blaming them for this feeling that's happening in our mind. So we see them as the cause of this feeling. So that's not very logical. So how could that person get into your mind and create that feeling? I mean, they're over there, your mind is here, so how is it that they are causing this unpleasant feeling? And another way to look at it, they might have someone else in their life who thinks they're wonderful. Their partner or their children or someone, people who work for them maybe. And so every time they look at that person, they feel admiration or gratitude, or they smile, happy to see them. So why is it that having such a different effect on that person? So it implies that we're projecting this unpleasant quality onto them based on how they're making us feel. Do you agree? So it's not actually... So you might, think of some politicians, for example. I think that they're just basically evil. Like, I don't know. Like, I think they just want to get rich and rip everyone off. That's what I'm thinking of. Yeah. So, I mean, I don't know. Like, that's how it appears. But there's probably people in his life who think he's wonderful, who he's helped a lot. Maybe he's been very generous to them. I don't know. But do you see the idea? Like, he represents something, I guess, to my mind. that I find repugnant, but that brings up this feeling. But then, so if you believe in Buddha, for example, the Buddha wouldn't have that feeling towards him. They would feel only compassion. So why would the Buddha feel compassion, whereas I'm feeling sort of aversion? And because the Buddha would say, well, people are behaving in the way that they're behaving because of what's going on in their mind. So as we said before, everyone's trying to be happy. That's why they're doing it. So everyone's got a different idea of how to be happy. You know, Vladimir Putin thinks invading the neighbouring country is going to bring some satisfaction and glory to his name or something. You know, I'm not sure what's going on in his mind, but I think it's some form of happiness in his mind that he thought he was going to get by invading Ukraine. And so that's a misconception. I don't think it's working out very well for him in that case. And from a Buddhist point of view, it's creating a huge amount of negative karma, so it's creating causes for huge amounts of suffering in the future. So from the Buddhist point of view, the Buddha would only have compassion for someone like that. So even if they're harming, you know, millions of people, they're actually object of compassion, because they would say that their mind is overwhelmed by this misconception that they thought they had this idea of invading another country would be a great thing to do, would somehow bring some benefit. So completely overwhelmed by that thought, and they went ahead and did it. And so from the Buddha's point of view, that would be only an object of compassion, that they got tricked by that misconception. And you can see that in our own life, how in the past we've done things we had seemed like a good idea at the time, and we were sort of carried away by this thought, and we followed it through and ended up, you know, hurting somebody, and then later on regretted it and sort of, what was I thinking, kind of thing. And you think, well, at the time it seemed like a good idea, and I was just doing what seemed right at the time, but your mind was sort of overwhelmed by this, whatever it was, you know, attachment or anger, or, you know, in anger we've said really harmful things to people that we've later regretted. So your mind was sort of overcome by that emotion at that time. So that would be how you would view someone like that, with compassion. So I guess then the Buddha is saying that we're not viewing that person in their entirety. We're just focusing on this one particular aspect of them and one particular point in time, and and only focusing on how they make us feel. So we're projecting that negative quality onto them based on how they make us feel. So it's quite interesting, I think, to investigate in that way. Any other examples you can think of?
Recurring one that has been in my life was a thought, belief that I'm not good enough.
Oh yeah.
And I've had to kind of look at it and then, or first off, figure out that's what it was, and then work out why I had that feeling or that thought, and then sort of take it apart, so then I realise that it's just a thought that has been kind of maybe conditioned or something inside of myself. But I can see that I had that thought, and it wasn't, it was just created for myself, and it wasn't the truth, although it had a massive effect on me.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a good example. So what would be some of them, like misconceptions or mistaken appearances, you think, that's involved in that particular problem?
Valuing something
Yeah, that's a good example. So I think like that would be, from a Buddhist point of view at least, an example of materialism, where you think, the goal of, whether it's a sporting goal or a goal of getting rich or whatever it is, it's an external thing, as I was saying before. So there's no guarantee that achieving that is going to bring the satisfaction that you're hoping. And also, as I was saying, even if you did achieve it, then it's still impermanent. So, for example, someone can come and break your record, the next day, or you can get injured and lose your position, in the next match. So it's impermanent. And also, you could reach that goal and, it just wasn't what you thought it would be. Everyone's saying how great you are, but you're just thinking, like, this is, not really satisfying. So it's an interesting example, which is not to say there's anything wrong with having those sort of goals, but we've got to be realistic about what they are. So having those kind of goals can be helpful because they can sort of motivate us and focus our mind, but we've got to realise that there's no guarantee that achieving that is going to bring the satisfaction. We could still be exactly the same person, but we've got this gold medal or whatever, and we're still feeling the same except with a gold medal sort of thing, or with a huge house, or whatever it is. Yeah. So it doesn't necessarily change the mind. Yeah, I think that example of feeling not good enough is an interesting one, and I think kind of very common in our culture. And I think partly that's, again, related to materialist way of thinking, where we value people based on sort of like what they've achieved. Like people, the idea is that people are not just sort of inherently valuable or worthy, they have to actually do something to be worthy. Or that's how we sort of tend to be taught to feel. If you don't have a degree, or you can't play the guitar or speak Italian or whatever it is, then you're not really very worthwhile, or So I've noticed, for example, like in the Tibetan culture, it was interesting. I think that's sort of different in that people seem to have to value people regardless of what they've achieved or who they are. Like in like the village drunk, for example, famous for getting drunk every week and smashing up things, but people still respect him, and he's still regarded as a worthwhile member of the community, for example, even though he's got this problem. So that's interesting. I think it's a cultural problem that we have, where we sort of put value on ourselves and other people based on what we've achieved. Yeah. I think so. Yep. Yeah. Sorry, what do you mean by remain linear? Can you explain what you mean by that?
Your self-worth, unless you shouldn't be attached to external things. For example, financially, like, very up and down, like, self-worth should be very up and down, but it should just remain the same, whether it's here or there.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's kind of an arbitrary measure of worth, and and not necessarily meaningful. But we also inflict that on ourselves. So we're measuring ourselves, and this voice saying, you're not really good enough. But you could even have that, even if you achieve all your goals, you could still have that thought. People say that you're not really good enough. Who was that? Some female sporting star, and she won some title, and then immediately she had this voice in her head saying, once is just a fluke, you got to do it twice for it to actually mean anything. I can't remember who that was. Yeah, good examples. So anyway, homework for this week. Think about things that are bothering you and how they might be related to mistaken conceptions and things. Mistaken conceptions of how things exist. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much. We're out of time, so thanks for coming and listening. See you again.